The night sky over the Mediterranean looked calm. But inside the cockpits of the American transport aircraft, nothing felt calm. It was July 11, 1943, the second night of the Allied invasion of Sicily. Only 24 hours earlier, thousands of Allied soldiers had stormed the beaches as part of one of the largest amphibious invasions in history. The operation was massive, chaotic, and already full of uncertainty. Now another wave of reinforcements was on its way. American C-47 transport planes from the troop carrier wings were flying low over the dark Mediterranean waters, carrying more than 2,000 paratroopers toward Sicily. Inside the aircraft, the soldiers of the 82nd Airborne Division sat quietly with heavy gear strapped to their bodies. Many of them were barely 20 years old. They checked their parachutes again and again while the engines roared around them. The men knew they were flying straight into a war zone, but they also believed something important. They believed the skies ahead were safe. Their commanders had assured them that the flight route was clear. What the pilots and paratroopers did not know was that the situation below them had completely changed. Throughout the entire day, the Allied invasion fleet anchored near the Sicilian coast had been under repeated attack by German bombers. Waves of Junkers Ju-88 aircraft had struck ships again and again, forcing naval gunners to stay at their weapons for hours. By nightfall, the sailors were exhausted, tense, and expecting another attack at any moment. Every radar operator, every anti-aircraft crew, and every lookout on every ship was waiting for the next enemy plane to appear. But there was one critical problem. Most of those ships had never been told that friendly aircraft would soon be flying directly over their heads. Some naval crews would later claim the message never arrived. Others insisted it came far too late. Either way, the result was the same. The sky over Sicily was about to turn into a deadly trap, not created by the enemy, but by the Allies themselves. The first American transport aircraft crossed the Sicilian coastline shortly after 10:20 p.m. For a few seconds, everything remained quiet. Then one ship fired. Just one. A single anti-aircraft gun lit up the darkness with a burst of tracer rounds streaking toward the sky. But war has a strange psychological effect. When one gun fires, others follow. Within seconds, dozens of ships joined in. Then hundreds. Suddenly the night sky exploded with gunfire. Bright tracer rounds shot upward from every direction. Searchlights swept across the clouds. Anti-aircraft cannons thundered across the fleet. To the nervous sailors below, the aircraft above them looked exactly like the German bombers that had been attacking all day. They fired at everything. The American transport pilots had no armor. Their planes carried no defensive weapons. And they were flying low and slow, barely 600 feet above the water at around 150 miles per hour. They were the easiest targets imaginable. The first aircraft was hit almost immediately. Flames burst from its wing as the pilot tried desperately to climb away from the storm of gunfire. But the aircraft lost control and crashed into the dark sea below. Other planes followed. Some exploded in midair. Others caught fire and spiraled downward. Inside the burning transports, paratroopers tried to escape while their aircraft fell apart around them. Some jumped into the darkness before their plane crashed. Others never had the chance. Entire formations of transport planes broke apart in panic. Pilots tried to evade the gunfire by turning away from the fleet, but that only made the situation worse. The carefully planned airborne drop collapsed into chaos. Pilots who managed to survive began dropping paratroopers wherever they could. Fields, forests, villages, and sometimes the open sea. Men landed miles away from their intended targets. Some paratroopers drowned when they hit the water with heavy equipment strapped to their bodies. Others were shot by enemy soldiers moments after landing. Some never even reached the ground. They were killed while still hanging from their parachutes. A few transport pilots simply gave up entirely. 8 aircraft turned around and flew back toward Tunisia, still carrying their full loads of paratroopers. But while the disaster unfolded in the sky, 2 senior American generals stood helplessly on the ground watching everything happen. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, had come to the airfield to greet his arriving troops. Standing beside him was General George Patton, one of the most famous commanders in the American Army. Both men watched the sky fill with explosions. Both understood immediately what was happening, and neither of them could stop it. There was no way to contact the ships, no way to signal the anti-aircraft gunners. No way to shut down the massive chain reaction of fear and gunfire spreading across the fleet. For the pilots trapped in the sky, it felt like flying through a wall of steel. By the time the shooting finally stopped, the damage was catastrophic. 23 American transport aircraft had been destroyed. 37 more were heavily damaged. 318 American soldiers and aircrew became casualties in less than half an hour. 81 paratroopers were dead. 60 aircrew members were killed alongside them. It became the worst friendly fire disaster in American military history. And shockingly, it wasn't even the last one that week. Only 2 nights later, another airborne operation approached Sicily, this time involving British paratroopers. More than 100 aircraft carrying soldiers of the British 1st Parachute Brigade flew toward the island. During the flight, several planes drifted off course. They passed directly over another Allied naval convoy preparing for combat. The sailors below had received warnings about possible German air attacks. They reacted exactly the way they had been trained. They opened fire. More aircraft were hit. More soldiers died. 4 Allied commanders. The lesson was clear. This was not simply a tragic accident caused by a single mistake. It was something much larger. The truth was terrifyingly simple. During large night operations, soldiers often had no reliable way to distinguish friendly aircraft from enemy ones. Radar systems existed, but they were far from perfect. Electronic identification systems called IFF, identification friend or foe, could transmit signals recognized by friendly radar. But there was a serious problem. During a massive invasion involving thousands of aircraft, the system could easily become overwhelmed. Signals would overlap. Equipment could fail. And in the chaos of combat, exhausted gunners would do what soldiers always do when they feel threatened. They would shoot first. Allied commanders knew that another massive invasion was coming. Within a year they would launch the largest amphibious assault in human history. If the same mistakes happened again during that operation, the casualties could be catastrophic. So the Allies began searching for a solution. Not a complicated technological solution. Something simple. Something visible. Something that every gunner could recognize instantly, even in the chaos of battle. The answer turned out to be something almost embarrassingly basic. Paint. Military planners decided that every Allied aircraft involved in the next invasion would receive a new visual marking. 5 bold stripes. 3 white. 2 black. These stripes would be painted across the wings and fuselage of every aircraft. On single-engine fighters they would be 18 inches wide. On larger twin-engine aircraft they would be 24 inches wide. The markings would be impossible to miss. The rule for gunners would be equally simple. If the aircraft did not have stripes, it was an enemy. Shoot it down. If it did have stripes, it was friendly. Do not fire. The idea seemed almost too simple. But simple solutions often work best during war. There was only one problem left. Secrecy. If the Germans discovered the plan before the invasion, they could paint identical stripes on their own aircraft. If that happened, the entire system would collapse instantly. So Allied commanders delayed the order to paint the aircraft until the last possible moment. The official approval came on May 17, 1944. But the actual painting would not begin until just days before the invasion of Normandy. When the order finally arrived, airfields across southern England erupted into frantic activity. Ground crews worked through the night with whatever tools they could find. Brushes, rollers, buckets, even mops and brooms. There were not enough proper painting supplies for such a massive task. Some crews simply guessed the measurements and painted by eye. Black and white paint became so scarce that Britain nearly ran out entirely. The stripes looked rough and uneven up close. But precision did not matter. Visibility did. Pilots walking toward their aircraft before the invasion often stopped in surprise when they saw the new markings. One American P-51 Mustang pilot later recalled staring at the massive black and white bands wrapped around his wings. They looked enormous. Impossible to ignore. That was exactly the point. Soon those stripes would become one of the most famous visual symbols of the entire Second World War. And when the invasion finally began, they would fill the skies. On the morning of June 6, 1944, more than 11,000 Allied aircraft flew missions over Normandy. The sky was crowded with fighters, bombers, transport planes, and gliders. But something remarkable happened that day. Despite the chaos of the largest invasion in history, friendly fire incidents against Allied aircraft were almost non-existent. Naval gunners saw the stripes, and they held their fire. The simple paint solution had worked. At least for one problem. Because war always finds new ways to create disasters. Only weeks later, Allied commanders would discover another kind of friendly fire, one that paint could never prevent. And the next mistake would kill hundreds more Allied soldiers. Even a 3-star American general. The success of the black and white invasion stripes gave Allied commanders a sense of relief. For the first time since the terrible friendly fire disaster over Sicily, they believed they had finally solved the problem of aircraft recognition during massive combat operations. The bold markings had worked perfectly during the Normandy invasion. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies, yet naval gunners and ground units rarely made the fatal mistake of shooting at their own planes. But war rarely allows simple victories to last for long. Only weeks after D-Day, another type of friendly fire disaster began to appear. One that had nothing to do with aircraft markings or confused naval gunners. This time the threat would come from American artillery, and the victims would be American soldiers. During the summer of 1944, Allied forces were fighting their way through the thick hedgerows of Normandy. The German army had transformed the countryside into a defensive nightmare. Every field was surrounded by tall earthen banks covered in dense vegetation, creating natural walls that blocked visibility in every direction. American infantry units could barely see 50 yards ahead. German soldiers used the hedgerows perfectly. Machine gun teams waited behind hidden openings. Mortars fired from concealed positions. Snipers watched narrow lanes where Allied troops were forced to advance. For the American army, artillery became the most important weapon in breaking these defenses. Before almost every infantry attack, Allied commanders would call in massive artillery barrages. Hundreds of guns would fire thousands of shells to smash German positions before American soldiers moved forward. Most of the time, the system worked. But the hedgerows created a dangerous problem. Visibility was terrible, and artillery units were often firing at targets they could not see. Forward observers positioned near the front lines would direct the guns using maps, radios, and estimated coordinates. If those coordinates were wrong, even slightly, the shells could land directly on friendly troops. And sometimes they did. One of the worst incidents occurred during the fighting near St. Lo in July 1944. American commanders had planned a massive bombing and artillery strike to break through German defensive lines and finally escape the deadly hedgerow country. The operation was enormous. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator bombers would drop thousands of tons of bombs on German positions. The attack was designed to open the way for a major ground offensive known as Operation Cobra. But something went terribly wrong. The bombers approached the target area flying parallel to the American front lines instead of perpendicular to them. When the first bombs fell, many landed short of the intended target. They landed directly on American soldiers. Entire units of the 30th Infantry Division were caught in the bombing zone. Explosions ripped through their positions without warning. Soldiers who had survived weeks of brutal combat suddenly found themselves under attack by their own air force. Panic spread across the front lines as bomb after bomb crashed into friendly territory. Radio operators screamed into their transmitters trying to stop the attack, but the bomber formations continued dropping their loads. By the time the bombing ended, hundreds of American soldiers were dead or wounded. Among those killed was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Army. McNair had been observing the operation from the front lines when the bombs fell. The explosion that killed him was likely caused by a bomb dropped from an American B-24 Liberator. His death shocked the entire American military leadership. Never before had a U.S. 3-star general been killed by friendly fire during combat. But despite the tragedy, the offensive continued. Operation Cobra eventually succeeded in breaking the German lines. American armored divisions surged through the gap and began the rapid advance across France that would eventually lead to the liberation of Paris. Yet the friendly fire incidents left a deep impression on Allied commanders. They realized something important. War had become so large, so complex, and so technologically advanced that controlling every part of the battlefield was nearly impossible. Thousands of aircraft, tanks, artillery guns, and soldiers were moving simultaneously across enormous areas. Even with radios, maps, and careful planning, mistakes were inevitable. Sometimes those mistakes were deadly. By late 1944, the war in Europe had entered a new phase. Allied armies had pushed deep into France and Belgium, approaching the borders of Germany itself. Many commanders believed the war might end before Christmas. But German leader Adolf Hitler had one final surprise planned. On December 16, 1944, German forces launched a massive counterattack through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The offensive involved more than 200,000 German soldiers and nearly 1,000 tanks. The sudden attack caught the Allied armies completely by surprise. The battle that followed became known as the Battle of the Bulge. American units along the front were overwhelmed by the initial assault. Entire divisions were forced to retreat as German armored columns pushed westward through the snow-covered forests. The winter weather made the situation even worse. Heavy clouds grounded most Allied aircraft, preventing air support from helping the soldiers on the ground. Communication between units broke down as roads became clogged with retreating vehicles and panicked refugees. Amid the confusion, rumors began spreading through Allied lines. German commandos had reportedly infiltrated American territory wearing captured American uniforms. These special units, led by German officer Otto Skorzeny, were tasked with spreading chaos behind Allied lines. They changed road signs, misdirected convoys, and attempted to gather intelligence. The psychological impact of these rumors was enormous. American soldiers suddenly began questioning everyone they encountered. Checkpoints appeared along major roads where military police demanded identification from every passing vehicle. Soldiers were asked strange questions designed to reveal German imposters. Some checkpoints asked drivers to name the capital of their home state. Others demanded the names of famous American baseball players. Anyone who hesitated too long could find themselves arrested at gunpoint. The paranoia spread quickly. At one checkpoint, an American officer was briefly detained because he pronounced the word gasoline differently from the guards questioning him. Even high-ranking officers were not immune. At one point, General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. 12th Army Group, was temporarily stopped and questioned by nervous American troops who feared he might be a disguised German commando. But while the soldiers on the ground worried about infiltrators, another danger was developing in the skies above the battlefield. By early 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final and most dangerous stage. Allied armies had crossed the borders of Germany, pushing deeper into the heart of the collapsing Nazi state. Cities burned across the country as Allied bombers struck industrial targets day and night. German transportation networks were shattered, fuel supplies were nearly gone, and entire divisions were fighting with little ammunition. Yet despite the catastrophic situation, German resistance remained fierce. Every town, every river crossing, and every forest could become a battlefield. For American soldiers advancing through Western Germany, one thing quickly became clear: the enemy was becoming more desperate, and that desperation often made the fighting even more dangerous. The German army began using a mixture of veteran soldiers, wounded survivors, and newly recruited teenagers from the Volkssturm, a last-ditch militia created by Adolf Hitler to defend the homeland. Many of these fighters had minimal training, but they were armed and ordered to fight to the death. In this chaotic environment, friendly fire incidents continued to haunt Allied forces. The problem was not simply poor communication. It was the scale of the battlefield itself. By 1945, millions of soldiers, thousands of aircraft, and tens of thousands of vehicles were moving across Europe simultaneously. Front lines shifted rapidly as German defenses collapsed and Allied forces advanced through towns and forests. Units frequently became separated from their parent divisions. Maps were often outdated. Radio signals were sometimes weak or jammed. Under those conditions, identifying friend from foe became extremely difficult. One example occurred during the chaotic fighting near the Rhine River. The Rhine represented the last major natural barrier protecting the interior of Germany. Allied commanders knew that once their armies crossed it, the road to Berlin would lie open. German forces were determined to prevent that crossing at any cost. In March 1945, American forces unexpectedly captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen after German engineers failed to destroy it in time. The bridge provided a rare opportunity for Allied troops to cross the Rhine quickly before German defenders could organize a proper defense. American soldiers rushed across the damaged structure while engineers worked frantically to reinforce it. German artillery and aircraft attacked the bridge continuously. The skies above the crossing soon filled with aircraft, American fighters protecting the bridge and German planes attempting to destroy it. In the confusion, American anti-aircraft batteries along the river opened fire at approaching aircraft. Several of the planes they fired at were American fighters returning from combat missions. Pilots suddenly found themselves dodging friendly anti-aircraft shells while trying to land at nearby airfields. Some aircraft were hit. Others narrowly escaped destruction. Even during one of the most important strategic moments of the war, friendly fire remained a constant threat. But the most tragic incidents often occurred not during major operations, but during smaller, chaotic engagements where communication completely broke down. In dense forests, soldiers sometimes fired at movement before they could clearly identify the target. In ruined cities, units advancing from different directions occasionally mistook each other for enemy forces. One American infantry officer later described the experience bluntly. He said that during combat in Germany, soldiers sometimes feared friendly artillery more than the enemy. Not because American gunners were careless, but because the battlefield was simply too confusing. Forward observers directing artillery fire often worked under incredible pressure. They relied on maps, binoculars, and quick radio transmissions to guide hundreds of artillery shells onto enemy positions. If a unit advanced faster than expected or misreported its location, those shells could land directly on friendly troops. Sometimes the mistake was discovered quickly. Other times it was discovered too late. Despite these dangers, Allied forces continued their relentless advance across Germany. Cities fell one after another. Cologne, Bonn, Frankfurt. Each defeat brought the German army closer to total collapse. Yet the war still demanded sacrifices until the very end. In April 1945, American and Soviet forces began closing in on Berlin from opposite directions. German defenses were crumbling everywhere. Entire units surrendered without fighting. Others continued resisting fanatically, convinced that defeat would bring terrible consequences. The skies above Germany were now dominated completely by Allied aircraft. American P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, and British Spitfires roamed the airspace freely, attacking trains, vehicles, and any remaining German aircraft they could find. But even in these final weeks, friendly fire continued to appear in unexpected ways. During one mission, a group of American fighter pilots returning from a strafing run over German supply convoys approached their airfield at low altitude. Anti-aircraft gunners protecting the base spotted the aircraft and reacted instantly. The pilots had been flying so low during their attack that the gunners could not clearly identify the markings on their wings. Within seconds, the airfield defenses opened fire. Tracers streaked past the fighters as the surprised pilots desperately rocked their wings to signal their identity. Fortunately, the gunners recognized the invasion stripes before any aircraft were destroyed. But the incident showed how quickly fear and confusion could trigger deadly mistakes. For many soldiers and pilots, friendly fire became an unavoidable part of modern warfare. It was a reminder that even the most powerful armies could not completely control the chaos of battle. As the war in Europe finally approached its end, the lessons learned from these tragedies would influence military planning for decades. Armies began developing better communication systems, improved radar technology, more advanced identification equipment. The goal was simple: reduce the risk of soldiers killing their own comrades. Yet no system could ever guarantee perfect safety. War remained unpredictable, and sometimes the greatest danger came not from the enemy, but from the fog of war itself. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. Millions of soldiers celebrated the victory. But for many veterans, memories of friendly fire incidents remain some of the most haunting experiences of the conflict. Because those losses felt different. They were not the result of enemy action. They were accidents born from confusion, fear, and the overwhelming scale of modern warfare. And the soldiers who died in those moments were often just as brave, and just as forgotten, as those who fell fighting the enemy. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing faster than anyone had predicted. American, British, and Soviet forces were advancing from every direction. German cities were falling one after another, and the once powerful Nazi war machine was now barely holding together. Factories had been bombed into rubble, fuel supplies were nearly gone, and entire German units were surrendering without firing a shot. But even as victory approached, the battlefield remained just as dangerous as ever. For the soldiers still fighting on the front lines, The war did not feel like it was ending. Every forest, every ruined village, and every narrow road could still hide deadly resistance. And sometimes, the danger came from an unexpected direction. Friendly fire. Throughout the war, the Allied armies had learned painful lessons about how easily chaos could turn deadly. Miscommunication, poor visibility, and the enormous scale of modern warfare meant that even the best-trained forces could make fatal mistakes. One of the final examples happened during the chaotic push into southern Germany in April 1945. American infantry units were advancing through small towns and wooded hills, clearing the last pockets of German resistance. The front lines were moving quickly, sometimes several miles in a single day. Units were often spread across wide areas, and communication between them could become unreliable. In one engagement, an American patrol moving through a forest suddenly came under machine gun fire. Believing they had encountered a hidden German position, the soldiers called for artillery support. Within minutes, American artillery batteries several miles away began firing shells toward the coordinates given by the patrol. But the coordinates were wrong. Another American unit had already moved into the area earlier that morning. The artillery barrage landed directly on friendly troops. By the time the mistake was realized, the damage had already been done. The soldiers who survived would later describe the moment as one of the most terrifying experiences of the war, hearing the unmistakable sound of incoming artillery and realizing it was being fired by their own side. Sadly, this was not the last friendly fire tragedy of the war. As the Allied advance accelerated, armies began encountering thousands of liberated prisoners, displaced civilians, and surrendering German troops. The roads became chaotic rivers of movement. Military vehicles, refugees, tanks, trucks, and marching soldiers all sharing the same narrow routes. In such confusion, identifying who was friend and who was enemy could become incredibly difficult. Sometimes a sudden movement, a misunderstood command, or a nervous soldier could trigger gunfire. And once the shooting started, it often spread quickly. But by late April, the war's final chapter was already unfolding. Deep inside the ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler remained in his underground bunker while Soviet forces closed in on the city. German resistance was collapsing everywhere else. On April 30, 1945, Hitler took his own life. Within days, the remaining German leadership agreed to surrender. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. Across the continent, millions of soldiers celebrated victory in Europe Day, often called VE Day. Crowds filled the streets in cities like London, Paris, and New York, celebrating the end of one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. For the soldiers who had fought across France, Belgium, and Germany, the moment brought relief, but also reflection. Many remembered the battles they had survived, the friends they had lost, and the strange, unpredictable nature of war itself. Because the battlefield had taught them a difficult truth. Not every loss in war comes from the enemy. Sometimes confusion, fear, and the sheer scale of combat can create tragedies that no one intended. Friendly fire became one of the harshest reminders of that reality. During World War II, thousands of soldiers from many different nations were killed or wounded by weapons fired by their own side. These incidents were rarely the result of negligence. More often they were the unavoidable consequence of modern warfare, a battlefield filled with smoke, darkness, noise, and rapidly changing positions. Historians studying the war later concluded that friendly fire incidents occurred in nearly every major campaign. From the skies above Europe, to the forests of France, to the final battles inside Germany itself. The Allied armies eventually developed better systems to reduce the risk, improved radio communication, clearer aircraft markings, radar identification, and stricter coordination between units. Many of those lessons would later shape the military strategies used in modern wars. But no matter how advanced technology becomes, one truth remains constant. War is chaos. And sometimes the greatest challenge is not defeating the enemy, but preventing tragedy among your own forces. That is one of the hidden stories of World War II, a reminder that even in the greatest victories, there were moments of confusion, sacrifice, and heartbreaking mistakes. And the soldiers who experienced them carried those memories for the rest of their lives.